January 1945, near Lumberg, northern Germany. The wind cuts across the frozen heathland like a blade drawn from winter itself. It is the kind of cold that finds the gaps in clothing, the cracks in walls, the hollow spaces between ribs. In a makeshift processing center, once a rural school, now stripped of everything that spoke of childhood, 217 German women stand in lines that stretch through corridors smelling of disinfectant and fear. Their hands shake, though whether from cold or terror they cannot say. Some are young, barely 20, their faces still holding the ghost of the girls they were before the war consumed everything. Others are older, mothers whose children are scattered across a shattered Reich, their whereabouts unknown, their fates unspoken. Outside, the engines of British trucks idle in the winter dusk. The women hear them, and they know what trucks mean. They have heard stories, whispers that moved through the final chaotic weeks as the Third Reich collapsed like a building whose foundations had rotted from within. Stories of reprisal. Stories of Soviet camps where German prisoners vanished into the vast frozen emptiness of Siberia. Stories of French resistance fighters who showed no mercy to collaborators. In those final days, as British and Canadian forces swept across northwestern Germany, many women who had served the Nazi state in any capacity, as auxiliaries, as communication operators, as administrators in the sprawling bureaucracy of occupation, faced a reckoning they had been taught would never come. They had been told they were on the right side of history. They had been told that victory was inevitable, that their sacrifice was noble, that the 1,000-year Reich would stand as testament to their devotion. Now they stand in a cold hallway, waiting for judgment from the very people they had been taught to despise as weak, as decadent, as racially inferior. The propaganda films had shown British soldiers as effete aristocrats, Americans as gangsters in uniform, democracy itself as a failed experiment that bred only chaos and mongrelization. They had believed it, or at least they had not questioned it loud enough for anyone to hear. When the doors open and the British soldiers enter, young men in battle dress, faces weathered by years of combat from North Africa to Normandy to the Rhine, the women flinch. Some close their eyes. One grips her companion's hand so tightly that her fingernails draw blood, though neither woman makes a sound. The silence is the silence of people who have decided that dignity is the only possession left to them. But the soldiers do not carry weapons drawn. They carry folded wool blankets, khaki-colored and thick, and they move down the lines distributing them with a methodical efficiency that speaks of orders followed, procedures implemented, humanity preserved even in the aftermath of inhumanity. One young woman, 19 years old, a former Blitzmittel who had operated telephone switchboards for Wehrmacht command, takes the blanket offered to her and stares at it as though it were an artifact from another world. The wool is coarse but clean. It smells of mothballs and storage, not blood. She wraps it around her shoulders and begins to weep, not softly, but with the kind of sobbing that comes from a place beyond language, beyond ideology, beyond everything she thought she understood about enemies and victors and the price of losing a war. Around her, others begin to cry as well. The sound fills the corridor, a strange and broken choir of women who had expected execution, or brutality, or at minimum the cold indifference of conquerors, and instead received warmth. A small, simple, bureaucratic warmth issued from military stores, distributed according to protocol, but warmth nonetheless. A British corporal, 23 years old, who had landed at Sword Beach on D-Day and fought through the bocage of Normandy and the frozen forests of the Ardennes, watches this and feels something shift inside himself. He had carried hatred like rations for 5 years. He had seen friends die in ways that made death itself seem like an act of obscenity. He had walked through the gates of Bergen-Belsen 3 weeks earlier and witnessed what human beings could do when ideology stripped away every restraint, every recognition of shared humanity. He had expected to hate these women. Instead, he feels only a vast, exhausted pity. This moment, unremarkable in the vast accounting of the Second World War, unrecorded in most histories, preserved only in scattered memoirs and the fading recollections of those who lived it, contains within itself a fundamental truth about the collapse of totalitarianism, that the true shock comes not from punishment, but from the sudden restoration of the very humanity one was taught to deny existed in the enemy. To understand the depth of this shock, one must first understand what these women had been conditioned to expect. The Nazi regime did not simply govern Germany. It attempted to rebuild German consciousness itself. From 1933 onward, an entire generation grew up saturated in propaganda that divided the world into stark racial and ideological categories. The education system, the Hitler Youth, the League of German Girls, the endless rallies and films and radio broadcasts, all delivered a consistent message: that Germans were engaged in an existential struggle against inferior races and degenerate democracies, that mercy was weakness, that the enemy would show no compassion because they were incapable of it. When Wehrmacht forces invaded Poland in September 1939, they carried with them not just weapons but a worldview that denied the full humanity of those they conquered. The brutality that followed, the mass executions, the ghettos, the deliberate starvation, the industrialization of murder, was not an aberration but the logical outcome of a philosophy that recognized only power and racial hierarchy. German women who served the regime, whether as uniformed auxiliaries or as civilian administrators in occupied territories, existed within this system. Many participated willingly, some with enthusiasm. Others complied out of fear or social pressure or simple careerism. But all were shaped by the regime's central lie: that the enemy was fundamentally different, fundamentally dangerous, and that any treatment of Germans by Allied forces would mirror or exceed the treatment Germans had meted out across Europe. Soviet behavior seemed to confirm this expectation. As the Red Army advanced into eastern Germany in early 1945, it brought with it a wave of vengeance. Soviet soldiers, who had witnessed the destruction of their homeland and the deaths of tens of millions of their countrymen, showed little mercy. Reports filtered westward of mass rapes, of summary executions, of entire populations displaced into forced labor. German propaganda seized on these accounts, some accurate, some exaggerated, all deployed to support the narrative that this was what all enemies did when they won. The Western Allies, Germans were told, would be no different. The British who firebombed Hamburg and Dresden, the Americans who incinerated Japanese cities, would bring the same pitiless retribution to Germany itself. For German women facing British or American capture in the final months of the war, this expectation was psychologically overwhelming. Many were young, products of the Bund Deutscher Medal system that had promised them purpose and belonging in exchange for obedience. They had grown up on narratives of German superiority and Allied barbarism. They had been taught that British men were weak and effeminate, that American culture was mongrel and corrupt, that democracy bred decadence. Yet these same supposedly inferior peoples had defeated the Wehrmacht, crushed the Luftwaffe, reduced German cities to rubble, and now occupied German soil. If they were as brutal as propaganda claimed, German women faced horrors. If they were not, if they showed restraint, discipline, even kindness, then everything the regime had taught was a lie. The truth was more complex than either propaganda or expectation allowed. British forces entering Germany in 1945 were disciplined but exhausted. They had been at war for nearly 6 years. They had suffered defeats and privations, celebrated victories that came at staggering cost, and witnessed atrocities that challenged their capacity for comprehension. When British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp on April 15, 1945, they found over 60,000 prisoners, many barely alive, surrounded by unburied corpses and the detritus of industrial murder. Medical officer Brigadier Glyn Hughes, surveying the camp, reported that conditions were beyond description. British soldiers, hardened by years of combat, wept openly or vomited at the sights and smells. Newsreel footage was rushed back to Britain and shown in cinemas, not just to inform the public, but to steel resolve for the occupation to come. Yet even after Belsen, even after the full scope of Nazi crimes became undeniable, the British military maintained strict discipline among its forces. Orders forbade fraternization initially, then gradually permitted it under controlled conditions. More importantly, from the highest levels of command down to individual units, There was an emphasis on correct behavior toward civilians and prisoners. This was partly pragmatic. Disorder would undermine occupation objectives, but it also reflected something deeper. The British Army, whatever its flaws and whatever crimes individual soldiers committed, operated within a framework that still recognized the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, and the notion that even enemies possessed certain inviolable rights. For German women encountering this reality, the cognitive dissonance was profound. Records from processing centers and POW camps run by British forces in early 1945 consistently describe German prisoners, male and female alike, expressing shock at their treatment. They had expected brutality and received bureaucracy. They had expected vengeance and received rations. They had expected to be stripped of dignity and instead were issued blankets, given medical care, processed according to protocols that, while imperfect, acknowledged their basic humanity. A blanket seems a small thing. It is not freedom. It is not absolution. It does not erase complicity, whether active or passive, in a regime that committed unprecedented crimes. But in that frozen January, in that repurposed schoolhouse, to women who had spent weeks or months in flight from advancing armies, who had watched their country collapse into chaos, who had been taught that capture meant death, in that moment, a blanket represented something beyond mere warmth. It represented a fundamental rupture with the world they thought they understood. The symbolic weight of such small mercies cannot be overstated. Throughout the Second World War, the material abundance of the Western Allies, and particularly the United States, functioned as a kind of ideological weapon, one that cut through propaganda more effectively than any leaflet or broadcast. When German soldiers first encountered American forces in North Africa in 1943, they found themselves facing an enemy that deployed not just superior numbers and firepower, but a logistical apparatus of staggering scale. American infantrymen carried chocolate bars in their rations, cigarettes in quantities that seemed inexhaustible, equipment that was replaced rather than endlessly repaired. German accounts from the North African campaign frequently express amazement at the sheer waste displayed by American forces. Discarded ration cans still half full, damaged vehicles, abandoned rather than salvaged medical supplies in quantities that German forces could only dream of. As the war progressed and German forces retreated on all fronts, this material disparity became increasingly obvious. By 1945, the average Wehrmacht soldier was malnourished, under-equipped, often wearing a patchwork of uniforms scavenged from the dead. In contrast, Allied soldiers, British, American, Canadian, were well-fed, well-clothed, and backed by a supply system that could deliver hot meals, clean socks, and mail from home even to frontline positions. This was not accidental. It reflected the productive capacity of democratic industrial economies that, once mobilized, could outproduce the Axis powers by orders of magnitude. But it also reflected a philosophical difference. The Nazi regime treated its soldiers as expendable assets in a racial struggle. Casualties were acceptable, even desirable, if they served the larger goal of Lebensraum and racial purification. Suffering was valorized as a test of Aryan will. The Wehrmacht's logistics were always inadequate, in part because the regime prioritized ideological warfare over the mundane necessities of keeping soldiers alive and effective. In contrast, the Allied approach, particularly the American approach, was fundamentally pragmatic. Soldiers were valuable, not as racial specimens, but as human beings who fought more effectively when well-fed, warm, and supplied with small comforts. This was not pure altruism. It was practical military doctrine informed by democratic principles that recognized individual human worth. When German prisoners encountered this system, the contrast was visceral. POW camps run by Western allies provided rations that, while basic, were often superior to what German civilians were receiving in the collapsing Reich. Prisoners received medical care, mail privileges, access to Red Cross packages. Under the Geneva Conventions, they were entitled to these things, and despite the vast numbers of prisoners and the logistical challenges, Allied authorities generally provided them. This adherence to international law was not perfect. There were violations, abuses, failures of oversight, but the framework held. For German women POWs, the experience was particularly jarring because Nazi ideology had gendered its racial hierarchy. Women were to be mothers and supporters of the racial state, protected within the domestic sphere while men waged war. The idea of German women as prisoners, subject to the power of enemy soldiers, carried implications of sexual violence that propaganda had made explicit. Soviet soldiers' behavior in Eastern Germany gave these fears concrete form. But British and American forces, while not immune to sexual violence, military records document court-martials for rape and assault, operated under legal systems that defined and punished such acts. The official policy was clear, and most units enforced it. When those women in the Lüneburg processing center received blankets instead of violence, they confronted not just Allied discipline, but the failure of everything their worldview had promised. They had been told that racial inferiors would behave as animals given the chance. They had been told that democratic weakness meant lack of resolve, that the Allies would collapse when tested. Instead, they faced soldiers who had endured years of combat, absorbed staggering casualties, witnessed unimaginable atrocities, and still maintained enough institutional and personal discipline to distribute blankets to enemy prisoners according to protocol. The tears that followed were not simply relief, though relief was certainly part of it. They were the tears of ideological collapse, the involuntary physical response to discovering that the fundamental organizing principle of one's universe was false. Consider the psychological journey of a woman like Marguerite Schulz, not her real name, but a composite drawn from numerous memoirs and testimonies preserved in archives. Marguerite was 21 in January 1945. She had joined the Blitzmittel, the female auxiliary service of the Wehrmacht, in 1942, working as a telephone operator in occupied France. She believed in the war, or at least she believed in Germany's right to defend itself. She had lost a brother at Stalingrad and a cousin in the bomber offensive against German cities. She had seen newsreels of German civilians pulled from rubble after RAF raids. When she was evacuated back to Germany in late 1944 as Allied forces closed in, she carried with her a deep conviction that British soldiers, the men who piloted those bombers, who had turned German cities into infernos, would show no mercy to German women. When British forces captured her unit in January 1945, she prepared herself for the worst. She had heard the stories from the East. She had been warned by propaganda and by whispered rumors, but what she experienced instead was bureaucratic processing. She was interrogated, tersely, impersonally about her service. She was searched by female personnel. She was photographed, fingerprinted, documented. And then she was given a blanket, directed to a transit camp, and fed a meal of bread, margarine, and tea. The tea was weak, the bread coarse, but it was food. There was no violence. There was no brutality. There was only the vast machinery of Allied military administration, grinding forward with impersonal efficiency. In her memoir, written decades later, Marguerite described her reaction. "I sat on the floor of that camp, wrapped in the British blanket, drinking the tea from a tin cup, and I could not stop crying. Not because I was grateful, I was too numb for gratitude, but because everything I had believed, everything that had given my life meaning for the past 12 years, was revealed as hollow. If the British were not the monsters we had been taught they were, then what did that make us? What did that make the things we had supported, the sacrifices we had made?" This existential crisis was common among German POWs in 1945, male and female alike. The experience of capture by Western Allied forces forced a reckoning that began not with political re-education programs, but with material reality. The blanket, the ration, the cup of tea. These mundane objects carried ideological weight because they contradicted the narrative that had sustained Nazi Germany. If the enemy possessed both the power to destroy and the restraint not to, if they showed discipline and humanity even in victory, then the racial theories that justified German aggression collapsed. The Herrenfolk, the master race, had been defeated by peoples they deemed inferior. And those peoples, in victory, displayed a civilization that the Reich had claimed did not exist outside German borders. The historical record bears this out in ways both statistical and personal. Of approximately 11 million German POWs captured by all Allied powers during and after the war, Roughly 7.5 million were held by Western allies, primarily Americans, British, and French. Mortality rates in Western camps, while far from zero and subject to significant variation, averaged between 0.15% and 1%, depending on location and period. In contrast, mortality rates in Soviet camps exceeded 15%, with some estimates ranging much higher. German prisoners in the West were processed through systems designed for repatriation and, eventually, reintegration. They were subject to denazification procedures, forced to confront evidence of Nazi crimes through documentary films and visits to concentration camps. But they were not, as a matter of policy, subjected to the kind of systematic brutality that characterized Soviet camps or that Germans had inflicted on prisoners in their own custody. The contrast was not lost on German prisoners. Letters and diaries from the period, many now preserved in military archives and historical collections, consistently express surprise at treatment that, while hardly comfortable, adhered to recognizable legal and humanitarian norms. German soldiers captured in the Battle of the Bulge described being given coffee by American captors. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute Germans had been drinking for years. German sailors captured after U-boat sinkings reported being rescued by Allied destroyers and treated on board with the same medical care as Allied wounded. German women captured in the final weeks of the war described, again and again, the moment when they realized that what they had been taught about Allied barbarity was propaganda. This realization did not always lead to immediate political transformation. Ideology is stubborn. It protects itself with layers of rationalization and denial. Many Germans in 1945 clung to the belief that they had fought a legitimate defensive war, that the atrocities were exaggerated or the work of extremists, that Germany's suffering absolved them of guilt. The process of denazification, implemented by Allied authorities with varying degrees of rigor, aimed to force confrontation with these evasions. Prisoners were shown films of liberated concentration camps. They were made to read affidavits from survivors. In some cases, they were marched to nearby camps and forced to witness the evidence firsthand. But the foundation of this confrontation was laid in those first moments of capture, in the difference between expected brutality and actual treatment. The blanket distributed in a cold hallway, the ration given to a hungry prisoner, the medical care provided to a wounded enemy. These acts did not excuse Nazi crimes or vindicate German suffering, but they established a baseline of humanity that made political re-education possible. They demonstrated that the values democracy claimed to uphold, rule of law, individual rights, restraint even in the face of provocation, were not merely propaganda, but principles that shaped behavior even in the chaos of war's end. For the British soldiers distributing those blankets, the moment carried its own weight. They were not automatons, unaffected by what they had seen and done. They had fought through years of brutal combat. Many had witnessed friends die in ways that made death itself seem like an obscenity. Some had participated in or witnessed their own side's excesses, the casual brutality that war normalizes, the plundering, the occasional violence against civilians. And many had walked through the gates of Bergen-Belsen or Buchenwald and seen what the regime they had defeated was capable of. Sergeant William Morrison, a Scottish infantryman who had fought from El Alamein to the Baltic, was present when his unit processed German prisoners in March 1945. In a letter to his sister, preserved now in the Imperial War Museum archives, he wrote, "We gave them blankets and porridge, and some of the women cried like children. Part of me wanted to hate them, wanted to ask if they cried for the Jews we found starving in the camps, or for the slave laborers worked to death in their factories. But mostly I just felt tired. They're defeated, they're cold, and they're frightened. We can afford to give them blankets. We won. That has to mean something more than just being able to do to them what they did to others." Morrison's ambivalence was typical. Allied soldiers were not saints, and their motivations were mixed. Some showed kindness out of genuine compassion. Others followed orders because discipline demanded it. Still others simply lacked the energy for cruelty after years of brutality. But whatever the individual motivation, the systemic result was the same. Allied occupation of Germany, for all its flaws and failures, did not replicate Nazi occupation of Europe. The contrast was stark, undeniable, and ideologically devastating to those Germans who still clung to the belief that all sides were equivalent, that everyone would have done what Germany did given the chance. This contrast extended beyond POW camps to the occupation itself. As Allied military governments took control of German territory, they faced the monumental challenge of preventing starvation and disease in a population of tens of millions, many displaced from their homes, most living in cities reduced to rubble by strategic bombing. The infrastructure was shattered. Food supplies were desperately short. The risk of epidemic disease was high. German propaganda had promised that Allied victory would mean deliberate extermination through starvation. The Morgenthau Plan, calling for Germany's deindustrialization, was seized upon as proof of genocidal intent. What actually happened was more complicated. The Morgenthau Plan was shelved, recognized as both impractical and morally indefensible. Instead, Allied authorities implemented a system that, while hardly generous and subject to significant regional variation, aimed to prevent mass starvation. Ration systems were established. Food was imported. Disease control measures were implemented. The goal was not German prosperity, but stability sufficient to prevent complete societal collapse and to enable the eventual reconstruction of a democratic German state. German civilians experienced this as a confusing mixture of hardship and relief. Rations were meager, often below adequate caloric intake, but they arrived with predictable regularity. Allied soldiers enforced non-fraternization policies, then gradually relaxed them. Black markets flourished, often with the tacit acceptance of occupation authorities who recognized that rigid enforcement would cause more suffering than it prevented. And through it all, there was a framework of law, imperfect and unevenly applied, but fundamentally different from the lawlessness that had characterized Nazi rule in occupied territories. The symbolic blanket, then, stood for something larger, the insistence that even enemies remained human, that victory did not confer the right to unlimited vengeance, that democratic values had meaning beyond their utility as propaganda. This was not universal. Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany followed very different principles, but in the British, American, and French zones, it was the guiding aspiration, if not always the achieved reality. The impact of this approach on German consciousness was gradual but profound. In the immediate aftermath of defeat, most Germans were too shocked, too focused on survival, too unwilling to confront their own complicity, to fully process what Allied treatment meant. But as months turned to years, as denazification proceeded, and the Federal Republic of Germany emerged in the Western zones, a generation of Germans grappled with the question Marguerite Schulz had asked herself. If the enemy was not monstrous, what did that make us? The answer was uncomfortable. It meant that German suffering, real, widespread, traumatic, did not balance the scales against Nazi crimes. It meant that the war was not a tragic misunderstanding, but a war of aggression fought for ideological goals that were fundamentally evil. It meant that millions of ordinary Germans, who had not personally killed anyone but had supported the regime, staffed its bureaucracies, cheered its victories, and looked away from its atrocities, bore a burden of guilt that could not be evaded. This reckoning was neither complete nor universal. Many Germans engaged in what historians call competitive victimhood, emphasizing their own losses to avoid confronting their complicity. The bombing of Dresden, the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe, the privations of the immediate post-war years, all were real traumas, and all were sometimes deployed to deflect from deeper questions of responsibility. But the fact that this deflection was necessary, that Germans felt the need to justify themselves, indicated that the moral framework had shifted. Nazi ideology had promised that might made right, that the strong were justified in dominating the weak, that mercy was weakness. Allied behavior, imperfect, sometimes hypocritical but fundamentally shaped by different principles, refuted that promise in the most concrete way possible. For German women POWs, this refutation began with a blanket. It continued through the years of occupation, through the Nuremberg trials that insisted on legal process even for the worst criminals, through the Marshall Plan that rebuilt former enemies as allies, through the patient construction of democratic institutions in a society that had embraced totalitarianism. The process was long, difficult, and incomplete. East Germany, under Soviet occupation, followed a different path. Even in West Germany, denazification was often superficial. Many former Nazis returned to positions of influence, and the full confrontation with the past took generations. But the foundation was laid in those early moments of contact between victor and vanquished, when the expected cruelty did not materialize, when the propaganda dissolved in the face of blankets and rations and bureaucratic processing. Those women who wept in the Lüneburg processing center, who had prepared themselves for brutality and received instead an impersonal efficiency that nonetheless acknowledged their humanity, carried with them a knowledge that would shape the rest of their lives, that the enemy they had been taught to hate possessed a civilization more humane than the one they had served. This knowledge did not absolve them. It did not erase their participation, active or passive, in a monstrous regime. But it created the possibility of transformation, of a future in which Germans could build a society based on different principles. The blanket was not forgiveness. The Allies did not come to Germany to forgive, but to defeat, occupy, and reshape. But it was an acknowledgement of shared humanity, a recognition that even those who had enabled evil remained, in some fundamental sense, human beings capable of change. The poetic weight of this moment lies in its very ordinariness. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand gestures of reconciliation. Just soldiers distributing blankets according to protocols designed by military bureaucrats to ensure minimal humane treatment of prisoners under international law. Just women receiving those blankets and realizing, in that instant, that everything they had been taught was a lie. History is made not only in the grand, decisive battles and the treaties signed by leaders, but in these small moments when individuals confront the gap between ideology and reality, between what they expected and what they experienced. Decades later, some of those women would tell their stories, hesitantly, often with shame, sometimes with defensive rationalizations. They would describe the cold of that January, the fear that had gripped them, and the shock of kindness from those they had been taught to despise. They would struggle to explain to grandchildren born in a prosperous, democratic Germany how their generation had believed what they believed, done what they did, supported what they supported. And often in those testimonies, they would return to that moment. The blanket, the tea, the absence of the brutality they had expected. "I wrapped that blanket around my shoulders," one woman recalled in an interview conducted in the 1980s, "and I felt something break inside me. Not relief, not gratitude, just emptiness. Everything I had built my life on was gone. The Führer was dead, the Reich was destroyed, and the enemy was handing me a blanket. I didn't know who I was anymore. I had to start again from nothing." Starting again from nothing, that was the gift and the burden of defeat. For Germany, the collapse of Nazism created the possibility of reconstruction on different foundations. The blanket did not make that reconstruction inevitable. The hard work of denazification, political education, and institutional reform was done over years by Germans and Allies together, often imperfectly, sometimes cynically, always incompletely. But the possibility began in those moments when ordinary Germans confronted evidence that their worldview was fundamentally false. And so we return to that cold hallway in January 1945, to the women standing in line, to the British soldiers with their arms full of folded blankets. The war in Europe has 2 more months to run. Cities will still burn, soldiers will still die, the full scope of Nazi crimes will still be uncovered in camp after camp. But in this moment, a different future becomes possible. Not through grand ideological pronouncements, but through the simple insistence that even in the chaos of civilization's collapse, some standards remain, some principles hold, some recognition of shared humanity persists. The women take their blankets. They wrap them around their shoulders against the cold that goes deeper than winter. They weep for reasons they cannot fully articulate, for the collapse of certainty, for the sudden terrible freedom of realizing that what they were taught was wrong. The British soldiers continue their work, processing prisoners according to protocol, doing their jobs with the weary professionalism of men who have done harder things than distribute blankets, but who understand, perhaps only dimly, that what they do in this moment matters beyond the immediate logistics of occupation. This is not reconciliation. Reconciliation will take decades if it comes at all. This is not justice. Justice will be pursued in courtrooms and struggled over in political forums for generations. This is something simpler and more fundamental. The recognition, forced by material reality, that human beings remain human even across the chasms carved by ideology and war. The Nazi regime had attempted to deny this recognition, to rebuild civilization on the principle that only some people were fully human, that others could be used and discarded without moral consequence. The blanket, the simple, ordinary, standard-issue British Army blanket, refuted that principle more effectively than any philosophical argument. In the end, that is what collapsed totalitarianism. Not just military defeat, though that was necessary, but the confrontation with evidence that the totalitarian worldview was false. German soldiers had expected American troops to be weak and poorly motivated. Instead, they faced armies of stunning power and resilience. German civilians had expected Allied occupation to mean extermination. Instead, they experienced occupation that, for all its hardships, aimed at eventual German recovery. And German women prisoners had expected brutality from their captors and received blankets instead. That dissonance between expectation and experience, between propaganda and reality, created the psychological space for transformation. Not everyone transformed. Some clung to their old beliefs, recast as nostalgia or grievance. Others simply moved on, choosing not to examine too closely what they had believed or why. But enough transformed, enough questioned, enough began the painful work of reconstructing their understanding of the world that a different Germany became possible. The blanket was not the cause of that transformation, but it was the symbol of the possibility, the first crack in the ideological edifice, the moment when what one was taught and what one experienced could no longer be reconciled. And in that moment of irreconcilable dissonance, something new could begin. The women leave the processing center in groups, bound for camps where they will spend weeks or months before repatriation. They carry their blankets with them. Some will keep them for years, not out of sentimentality, but because in the chaos of post-war Germany, anything warm and durable is precious. Others will trade them for food or other necessities. A few will discard them as soon as possible, wanting no reminder of defeat and captivity. But all will remember. They will remember standing in that cold hallway, expecting death or degradation, and receiving instead a folded blanket from a young British soldier who looked as tired as they felt. They will remember the cognitive dissonance of that moment, the way it forced them to confront questions they had spent years avoiding. And whether they embrace those questions or retreat from them, whether they undergo genuine transformation or construct elaborate defenses against self-examination, they will carry that memory for the rest of their lives. History is made of such memories, not the grand sweep of armies and ideologies, but the moments when individual human beings confront the gap between what they believed and what is true. In January 1945, in a repurposed schoolhouse in northern Germany, that confrontation took the form of tears shed by women who had expected to be killed, and were instead given blankets. It was a small moment in the vast catastrophe of the Second World War. But it contained within itself the seed of something larger, the possibility that even from total defeat, even from total moral collapse, a society could rebuild itself on different principles, could learn different lessons, could become something other than what it had been. The blanket was just a blanket, but in that place, at that time, to those women, it was also a revelation. And sometimes, revelations come not in grand pronouncements, but in small mercies that refute everything one has been taught to believe. That is the paradox and the power of democratic civilization. It insists on standards even when it would be easier not to, on restraint even when vengeance would be understandable, on recognition of common humanity even toward those who denied that humanity in others. It does not always succeed. It fails often, sometimes catastrophically. But the aspiration itself, imperfectly embodied in protocols and procedures and the distribution of standard-issue blankets to enemy prisoners, carries a power that ideology cannot match, the power of lived reality to refute lies. And so the women wrap their blankets tighter and shuffle forward into an uncertain future, into a Germany that no longer exists as they knew it, into lives that must be rebuilt from ruins both physical and moral. They do not yet understand what that future will require of them. They do not yet grasp the full weight of what they were part of, what they enabled, what they failed to resist. Those reckonings lie ahead in years of difficulty and discomfort and gradual, painful education. But in this moment, they understand one thing with absolute clarity. They are alive when they expected to be dead, they are warm when they expected to be cold, and the enemy has shown them a mercy they did not show to others. That understanding, however uncomfortable, however difficult to integrate into their sense of themselves, is the beginning of wisdom. It is the first step on a long road back to civilization. And it begins with a blanket distributed in a cold hallway by soldiers who had every reason to hate, but chose duty instead. That choice to maintain standards, to follow protocols, to recognize humanity even in the defeated enemy, is what separates civilization from barbarism. Not the absence of hatred, which would be inhuman to expect, but the restraint of it. Not the absence of suffering, which war makes inevitable, but the refusal to inflict unnecessary suffering. Not the erasure of guilt, which cannot and should not be erased, but the insistence that even the guilty remain human and must be treated as such under law. These are not easy principles to uphold. They are hardest to uphold precisely when they are most necessary, in the aftermath of total war, when emotions run highest, and the desire for vengeance is most understandable. That British and American forces largely upheld them in 1945, despite everything they had suffered and witnessed, speaks to the strength of democratic institutions and values. Not perfectly, there were failures, abuses, moments when individuals and units fell short. But systemically, institutionally, the framework held. Prisoners were processed according to law. Camps were administered according to international conventions. Blankets were distributed to the cold. And in those mundane acts of institutional decency, a powerful message was delivered. That the values democracy claimed to represent were real, that the contrast between Allied and Axis conduct was not mere propaganda, but reflected genuine philosophical differences about human worth and the limits of power. For Germans who received that message, for those women weeping in the Lüneburg processing center, it was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape Europe and echo through generations. The blanket was just a blanket, but it was also, in that moment, proof that another world was possible, that even from the depths of totalitarian catastrophe, a path forward existed, that the principles Germans had been taught to despise as weakness were in fact the foundation of a civilization more enduring than anything the thousand-year Reich had built. That mercy, properly understood, was not the abdication of power but its highest expression. The choice to show restraint when one has the capacity for vengeance, to maintain standards when one could abandon them, to recognize humanity when one could deny it. Those women would carry that knowledge forward into the post-war world. Some would embrace it, becoming builders of the democratic Germany that emerged from occupation. Others would resist it, clinging to old grievances and mythologies. Most would fall somewhere in between, navigating the complex terrain between denial and acceptance, between guilt and self-justification. But all would remember the moment when their expectations were upended, when the enemy showed them a humanity they had not expected, when a simple blanket became a symbol of everything they had been wrong about. And that memory, multiplied across millions of Germans who underwent similar experiences in the chaotic months of 1945, became part of the foundation on which a new Germany was built. Not the only foundation. There was also coercion, political calculation, economic incentive, and the external pressure of occupation. But among the foundations, nonetheless, a recognition forced by experience that the totalitarian path led only to destruction, and that the democratic alternative, for all its flaws, offered something totalitarianism never could: the possibility of dignity even in defeat, of humane treatment even for enemies, of law that constrained power rather than merely serving it. In the end, that is what the blanket represented. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not the erasure of German guilt, but the insistence that even guilty nations and individuals remained part of the human community, subject to law and entitled to minimal standards of treatment. It was a cold comfort in a cold hallway in the ruins of a defeated Reich. But it was comfort nonetheless, and more importantly, it was truth. The truth that totalitarianism had spent 12 years trying to destroy. The truth that human beings share a common nature that cannot be erased by ideology. That mercy is possible even in the midst of justice. And that civilization survives not through the strength of its armies, but through its insistence on standards that transcend the immediate demands of power. The women file out into the winter dusk, wrapped in their blankets, and behind them the British soldiers continue their work, processing the next group, distributing more blankets, maintaining order in the chaos. They are tired men doing difficult work in the ruins of a war that has already lasted too long. But in their professionalism, in their adherence to protocol, in their willingness to see the people before them as human beings deserving of minimal decency despite everything those people's nation had done, they become agents of something larger than themselves. The slow, difficult, imperfect triumph of civilization over barbarism, of law over lawlessness, of shared humanity over ideological division. This is not a story of redemption. Redemption would be too easy, too comfortable a conclusion. But it is a story of possibility, the possibility that even from the worst of human catastrophes, a better path forward can be found, not through grand gestures but through the accumulated weight of small decencies, of protocols followed, of standards maintained, of blankets distributed to those who need them, regardless of who they are or what they have done. And in that possibility lies hope, not for the erasure of history or the forgetting of crimes, but for the reconstruction of human community on foundations that acknowledge both the depths of human evil and the stubborn persistence of human decency. The blanket cannot undo the past, but it can, perhaps, make a different future possible. And sometimes, in the ruins of total war, that is enough.